Dreitz, who is a University of Montana professor and a director of the Avian Research Center, is it called? Avian Science Center in Missoula. She's come all the ways up here to talk to us. And this part I'll have to read because it's a bit of a mouthful. She's talking about advancing field and analytical techniques to inform avian conservation. And she'll let us know what that all means. Welcome to Victoria. Yeah, right. Well, if you need them, they're here.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me? I've never used a mic before, so this is going to be new. And Jake told me I had to do it. So we'll see how it goes. Because I'll probably try to click the mic or something like that. Two things. I did change the title of my talk a little bit to informing avian conservation through local research, landscape scale conservation, and embracing new technologies. And I decided to do that because I wanted to give you like the range of the different things we do at the Avian Science Center, because we do lots of different things. And so I just wanted to give you some kind of general breadth of what all those cool things are that we do. Let's see here. There we go. So as most of you here, I have a very fondness for birds. And I look at pictures like this, and for me, they bring me lots of joy. They help me decrease my stress level in my life. And prior, some of the work I've done as a wildlife biologist, a lot of it has focused on birds. But I was talking to David earlier today, and I spent a little time on ungulates. I ran back to birds as fast as I could. And some of that is they bring some really interesting challenge and some cool things that, you know, just makes me excited about my job. And I know many of you are here because you really have that same enjoyment for birds. Anybody have an idea of what species these little guys are? Any thoughts?
Curlews?
Ooh, close. Upland shorebird. They are here in Montana. Anybody else want to guess?
Upland sandpiper.
Ooh, you're on a roll. These are mountain plovers.
Oh, that was my third guess.
And I just bring them up. Before I came here to the University of Montana, I've been here since 2011. 2011, I arrived here. In 2013, I got my professorship job. But prior to that, I worked on this species in Colorado, working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And during that time, this species went through 2 different listing decisions. And a lot of that had to deal with the fact that it was declining, and we really thought things were going bad with it because it likes to nest on agricultural fields. I'm a farm girl by nature. I grew up in the northeastern plains of Colorado, and working through both the ecology, the economic, and the social aspects of trying to engage landowners at the same time of listening to them, like if I have to change my farm practice, here's what it's going to mean, really resonated with me. And over my time, I've really been working and using birds, both not only as studying the ecology, but thinking about them socially. How do we get people more engaged? How do we use them to start thinking about climate change and help get people more embraced with doing some things for our life? And also just thinking like, how can we work together and trying to do things together with people? And birds are really cool. You know, they have these really unique behaviors. There's so many of them, which makes them really challenging and fun. We see these cool kind of flocking patterns. These are starlings. And it's really cool that you see a silhouette of a bird and a flocking behavior of starlings. We also see that really cool mating behavior of sandhill cranes. I've been fortunate to work on cranes, and you go out there and you watch the kind of cool mating behavior, which it's really neat to see. And it's just like, now why are they doing that versus another species who does something totally different? So it really is fun to have all these challenges. And I hope many of you have seen loons. and observe the little guys riding on their back. And it's one of the few bird species we see where the juveniles are actually hanging out on the back of their parents. I know I can't do that with my kid. It stopped when he was like 20 pounds. So now he's 14 and way heavier. I'm not doing that. And then we just see these cool expressions from things like burrowing owls, where you just see something like that and you're like, yeah, what's going on, man? So birds to me just are really cool, and they do so many unique things that make them really fun. They make them really challenging, but once in a while they make them really hard to understand what's going on and why they're responding the way they are. So for me, how I'm going to set up this talk, birds are cool. They're the thing I enjoy. I have tried to work on other species, wildlife species, and I always come back to birds because they really are just the thing I'm passionate about. What I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about ASC, which is the Avian Science Center. I know many of you have heard about it. Many of you probably have been aware of my predecessor, Dick Hutto, who was originally the founder of the Avian Science Center. And I took it over upon his retirement. So I just want to take a little bit, talk about the history and kind of who we are, just because I know many of you have heard about it. And then I'm going to give you some examples of our current and the future research that we are doing currently at the Avian Science Center. And I will say, if you guys need speakers in the future, give me a call. I have a gamut full of students who I know would love to come and need to come and talk to people. So who's ever in charge of that committee, please get my information because I can help you find speakers. But I've defined these into local research, landscape conservation, and then embracing new technologies. It's just some general categories. I've clumped the various work that we have been doing. So who are we? Back in 2004, Dick Hutto established the Avian Science Center as a border region center on campus. And he did that. He was in the Division of Biological Science at the time, which at the time was in the College of Arts and Sciences. It's now the College of Humanities and Sciences. He did that on the basis that he had a long-term U.S. Forest Service grant that helped develop the land bird monitoring that was done at the Forest Service at the time. Unfortunately, I don't believe the Forest Service is still implementing that same program, and they've kind of shifted gears a little bit with a broader program that's being actually done across the West, and it tends to keep going eastward. And so it's very similar to like our breeding bird survey, but it's a little bit different of a monitoring program that's being done. And at that time, it was being supported mainly by the Forest Service, but as Dick got that established, he started branching out into other avenues like Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. They have some work continually to go with a lot of the local areas in town, like the MPG Ranch. They're really involved with a lot of bird work that's being done out there. That center then moved over to the Franke College of Forestry and Conservation when I took it on. There is still a bird group in the Division of Biological Sciences called UMBL, the University of Montana Bird Ecology Lab. They're continuing to do a lot of that work that Dick kind of ended with, where they do a lot of bird banding and a great educational program. They work a lot with the school kids at around the Missoula area, and I even know some kids come from Butte. I think some of you have probably gone out to their banding stations and get an opportunity to hold birds and see birds. And they do a lot of other different things. And it's kind of one of those things that they kind of have their mission, and the Avian Science Center has a little bit different. And there are times where I get project requests and I'm like, oh, this fits over with the bird ecology lab a little better. And we work together in tandem that way, knowing what the strengths are of each other. Because there's tons of bird work to do. There's much more bird work, I'd say, in this state than even the bird ecology lab and the Avian Science Center can accomplish. There are oftentimes, I think we both turn down stuff. We just don't have capacity. So it's sad, but that's the way things are. So in 2013, I came on and it moved to the College of Forestry and Conservation. And some of that is just my background is really applied. I worked for a state agency. I still work a lot with the agencies. And so a lot of the work we do is really driven by those management needs that need to happen. We also made it really more directly linked to the wildlife biology program. It's the only academic program at the university that I support. Where before Dick was involved with biology and wildlife biology and purely support the wildlife biology program. So all my students get their degree in wildlife biology. And as I mentioned, I do lots of work. Since I've been the director, I've worked with about 25 different entities, being U.S. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Geological Survey, the USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service. I've also worked with organizations like the World Wildlife Fund, the World Conservation Society. And so there's been a lot of different things that we've going on to help support the work we do. And we've continued to grow the support that we have internally within the Avian Science Center. So who are we? Well, I'm the director. I am considered a 0-point time, so half of my job is to direct the Avian Science Center within the 9-month appointment I have at the university. Beyond that, I fundraise to support graduate students. Currently, I have 6 of them. 2 of them are graduating. I'm so happy. I have a bunch of undergrads that work for me. 3 particularly are doing independent research with me. And in fact, one of them tonight is actually presenting her research at our local Audubon chapter. Or I'd probably need her come up here and tag team with me tonight. And then we also have various research associates that are on there. So that's the staff and that's the group that makes the Avian Science Center. At the current moment, it fluctuates and changes as grad students come and go and as undergraduates come and go. And as I have support for my staff being the non-students that are out there. Our mission is always, the foundation is doing research. Everything we do has a research base and usually a very more applied, so management or conservation oriented research. And a lot of it then within that, we do things like science support. We might assist. I know many years ago, I had a staff member come up here and talk to you guys about doing eBird counts at the National Bison Range. When Faye Tong was up here with Amy Siemens, asking for support. So we developed those eBird routes on the National Bison Range. We do some kind of science support for various organizations. We also help with conservation delivery, which is like, okay, now we know this knowledge, what do we do? How do we move forward and how do we help benefit what's happening? And then a lot of we do also is education. And that education is not just at the college level students, but we do a lot of other things where it might be with agency personnel who want to come back and get education. I know at the university, we have the MOLI program, which we've participated in. So we do a variety of different things. And here I just have our mission statement, which is to promote informed decision-making based on ecological research, where we do the collection, the synthesis, and the communication, the knowledge about birds and their ecosystem. And for me, I really think more about an ecosystem and what's happening within a system. And then I use birds to help inform me on what's happening within those ecosystems. So I kind of call birds the model assemblage or my little test tubes that help me understand what's happening at these systems that we're interested in. Feel free to ask questions as I go along. So now I'm going to tell you the fun stuff and probably more what you guys are here for instead of hearing about logistics is what do we do? And so I'm going to start talking a little bit about that. So what I call local or targeted research, these usually are ones that the management agencies come to us and ask, like, can you help us understand? We may be implementing some kind of practice and we want to know if we're doing good or bad things. Some of the times they're very localized. So it might be that we do a study in one county in Montana and it only is going to apply to there. It may not be broadened out to like, this is a regional thing now that we could use to manage better. It could, it just not always does. And I'm going to give you an example of both of those. Some of that work that we've been doing deals with livestock grazing, and I've been involved with some work that looks at the effects of livestock grazing on the greater sage-grouse here in Montana. We're also involved with kind of, I would say, a sister project. These this next project actually is in the same study area with, instead of looking at livestock grazing on sage grouse, we're looking at it on songbirds that use that. And some of that is coming from like, if we do good things for sage grouse, are we also doing good things for some of the other species within that same habitat area? I've also been involved in some of how I know Rob is the raptor world. I spent many years, in fact, my PhD was working on raptors, where we're looking at space use and movement, bald and golden eagles in Alaska. There's been lots of work down here in the lower 48 on eagles, not so much up in Alaska. And the eagles, especially the bald eagles up there, are very different. If you want to see an eagle, we tell people to go to a landfill. There are tons of them up there. And you go to any landfill and there you see tons of them. You see some of them also maybe at some salmon hatcheries or some salmon areas. But some of you may have heard our salmon are not doing so well. We're farming more salmon, our natural salmon populations aren't doing well. And so we're not seeing eagles hanging out in some of those streams in Alaska like they used to. They're all going to these landfills. So we're trying to figure out what's going on with them. How are they doing based on they are shifting, kind of what habitats they've been using over time. But I'm going to focus today more and give you a little more details on this study on migratory songbirds. Some of that is when I moved here to Montana, this was the first project I got up and going. And we've just finished it. We actually finished it a little bit early because that darn thing we call a pandemic happened. And I just, supposed to be the last year. And when I thought about taking 12 technicians out to rural Montana, where the local hospital had 3 beds, I was like, I'm not doing that. It wasn't going to be a good thing. So, and a lot of this work, I'm sure most of you have heard about the Sage Grouse Initiative. How many of you have? Okay, a few of you have not. So the Sage Grouse Initiative started many years ago when we started seeing the listing petitions happening with the greater sage grouse. It's gone through that federal listing decision process. And it's because we were losing sagebrush habitat, and concurrently with that, we were losing sage grouse. And sage grouse, primarily, you only see them in the sagebrush system. And so there's some concerns like what's going on. We're seeing a decrease both in habitat and the birds. What do these birds need? What's going on? And so this Sage Grouse Initiative arose, mainly supported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's NRCS branch. And it came about to figure out like, what are the threats? What's happening across this broader landscape? And what do we need to learn to figure out what's really happening with this bird? Here, mainly in Montana, this initiative proposed that we need to understand what's going on with livestock grazing. We have these areas, our main threat is, it's not really a threat, or at that point, we thought it was a threat of livestock grazing is causing these populations here in Montana to decline. So let's start looking at these grazing characteristics and maybe adjust them to see if things get better. And the NRCS then went out with individual, met with ranchers and talked to them and asked them about their grazing, what they were doing, and kind of set up individual management plans where they called it a rest rotational system. How many of you are familiar with rest rotation grazing? Very few of you. Okay, so often I'm going to make the analogy between a rest rotation and a season long. I'll tell you, season long is usually like you might put cattle in a pasture in May, you leave them there in November, and you do the same thing the next year. It's the same time every year the cattle are placed in that pasture. Rest rotation is a system of maybe you put your cows in May, you take them out in August, you don't put them back in maybe till that following August. You don't repeat that same kind of growing season of the plants. Cows are not present at the same time, so you're kind of altering the system. You could maybe not have cattle in an area for 2 or 3 years, but when you put them in one time, that next time you put cattle in a pasture, it will not be during the same growing season of your plants. So you maybe potentially end up seeing a different vegetative response. since you're not having the grazing happen at the same time each year, is the thought process. And so NRCS work with all these different landowners to figure out how many pastures do you have? How many would you be willing to enroll in this program? And it was a voluntary incentivized program for these landowners to adjust potentially the grazing that they were doing. And so then we came along and we just wanted to say like, okay, now that we know these plans are happening, let's see how the birds are responding and seeing if we are benefiting with these grazing regimes or not. So that was the main goal that we had. And what we looked at with the songbirds was we looked at nest density and nest success. So not just that, are we seeing the birds produce young at the same rate, but are there more nests maybe on these rest rotational systems? So if you have more nests and you have young being produced at the same rate, it's actually you end up getting more young. We also were looking at just, are the birds present there during the breeding season? Are they shifting? Are they moving? Maybe they not like these rest rotational systems, or maybe do they not like these season-long grazing systems? And then we also looked at, are there just different species? You know, maybe there's the same number of species, but maybe there are different species using these different systems. And today, I'm only going to focus on this nest density and nest success part, because I don't want to be here for 4 hours, and Jake told me I couldn't be. So you guys would all fall asleep. So the nice thing about this work, it's 7 years, and very seldomly have I been in a study where we've had, you know, data more than 2 or 3, maybe 5 if you're lucky years. So it is 7 years of data, which has been really cool. And we've just finishing, and I have a PhD student here in about 3 weeks who's actually going to defend, who's wrapped up all these 7 years and going to tell us what everything means. But some preliminary, or first of all, we did this out in Roundup, Montana. Does anybody know where that is? A few. Lana's laughing. It's back by home, right? Yeah, it's just north of Billings. And you can barely see it up here. Billings, this little inset is what I have here. That little star is actually Roundup. And so we did this work out there in that area. It's an interesting area because the sagebrush, a tall sagebrush is maybe knee high, which I found interesting because I've been in a lot of different sagebrush habitat, and there's been times it's been way over my head and it wasn't really tall. And so it was really interesting because I came in going, well, I don't know how to actually do some of this stuff because I had different expectation of much taller, much more lush sagebrush. So it's kind of on that fringe of grassland and a sagebrush steppe. Beautiful country, really nice area, and primarily ranching and cattle ranching. There's a little bit of ag, but I wouldn't say there's lots of ag in this area, or ag being crop production. Those little dots here of this map, there should be squares, but they look like little, I don't know what they look like. Fly poop, I don't know. But each one of those represents a plot that we set up, and it's a 500 meter by 500 meter sampling plot. And this is where we would go out and we count birds, and then we'd also look for nests on each one of these plots. And we do that 3 times every year over 7 years, which has been a really nice data set to have because we knew we have a group of songbirds, and we knew that birds don't always breed at the same time. All these species that, like, you have one species come in, it seems like a week later another species starts breeding, then a different species starts breeding. It's all basically from May to July, but we've had it as early as April 1st. We've had it go into the middle of August. And so, but you definitely see a spectrum of when the different birds are coming in and starting their breeding. And so we located and we monitored a bunch of nests. The fun stuff, always finding little babies in nests is a fun thing to do. But the other thing we did, and when you're a wildlife biologist or a birder, these are the things that aren't so fun, is you're measuring things like vegetation. It's just, I don't enjoy it. I want to go play with birds. But we ended up looking at things like, when were the cattle out there? How long were they out there? When did they go in? And we worked with a lot of the private landowners to obtain a lot of information about their grazing regimes on an individual pasture level. And some of these ranchers had like 20 pastures. So every year we'd sit down with them and ask them all about their grazing. It'd be things like duration. It would be, are you part of this conservation SGI system using their rest rotational system? If not, what other kind of system are you using in each one of these pastures? What's your grazing intensity? You know, given the fact that no two pastures are the same, what are the characteristics and how many animals are you able to put on to get that production you need? And then we also did a lot of veg sampling, looking at shrub cover, vegetation height, bare ground components. And so we had quite a nice data set for all this work and tons of samples. So as a scientist, it makes me very, very happy when I have tons and tons of samples because I feel very confident then in some of my results. These are the fun things my technicians got to do. And I put these pictures in particularly to show you, this is kind of what our sagebrush system looked like. So we had areas that were really purely almost grass. You can see kind of back here, a little dark stuff, that's sagebrush. So it's really not high density sagebrush either. So we had some grassland, areas that were more purely grassland. And then down here, we did have something that was more what, at least when I originally went out there, thought would be sagebrush. Not as tall as I thought, coming from Colorado, but at least it was like, it's a shrub. It's not pure grass. But we had to use kind of two different techniques to find nests, where the top one we're using more of a rope drag. And because pulling that rope in sagebrush just never works. Yeah, I see a few of you shaking your head. It doesn't work. Don't try it. I don't recommend it. We ended up taking what we call just dowels, and you tap the sagebrush and that elucidates the adult to like flush. And then you just hope they go back in a certain amount of time and then you can find the nest. So we had to use kind of two different techniques just based on what our sampling plot looks like. And we ended up focusing on these species. Can anybody tell me which bird this one is? Which species? You gotta get your waterfowl pictures back. Yeah. Any ideas? Close. This is a brewer sparrow. It is a sagebrush obligate species, we call it. So it's one of the species that if you're in sagebrush, you're most likely to see this species, a brewer sparrow. Anybody know what this one is? This one likes grasslands more.
Thick-billed longspur.
Thick-billed longspur. This is also a species that we're seeing huge declines in of conservation concern, but it likes that grass stuff. So it was hanging out more in those more grassy plots. And here we have what we call a vesper sparrow. Vespers tend to be more generalist. So you'll see them hanging out in lots of different areas. I know in Missoula, I live in an area where I go hiking and it's mainly grassland and they're hanging out all over there. So they tend to like lots of different things, but we see a lot of them in these areas also. So we pick kind of a suite or these three different species to focus on that kind of use kind of different habitat types within that sagebrush steppe system. So we have something that really likes shrubs and needs a shrubs, something that was more in those grasses, and then something that was happy in either a shrub or a grass. Who knows why they chose if they were in grass or shrub, but they were everywhere. We would go out, we would find their nests, and once we would locate their nests, we would, take a coordinate so we knew how to go back and monitor it. We would also take photos and age the nests, and aging the nest was a really important thing for us because we were developing some new techniques to look at nest density and nest success. And about every 3 days, we'd go back and see if the nest was still active, if the nest failed, if it was predated, and we take that information. These birds are only have eggs for about 10 to 14 days. The little guys are only in the nest for about 5 to 10. So it's not very long that they actually have a nesting effort. It goes pretty quick. So we tried to get back there about every 3 days. And these are just some cool pictures. It's always fun to look at the nestlings. And so we just have a bunch of nestlings here in a nest. This is a brewer's where we have 4 guys hanging out there. And we would be able to tell if it actually was successful. We would look for things like a bunch of whitewash that I have here circled in the yellow. And if you saw a lot of whitewash, it's assumed in the literature that they actually fledged the young. Times we would go back and the nest would just be pulled apart. And that usually meant some predator got them. Once in a while, we would see dead nestlings, which is probably something happened to the adults. But for most of the time, if we felt they failed, it was because that nest was totally torn apart, or we couldn't even find the nest. It was blown out, or the predator took it with them. Some interesting things happened there. We ended up finding a fair number of nests, and here are just the 3 species where it was anywhere from 30, I believe, up to 100. This one year we had over 100, almost 140 nests for brewers. And so we had a fair number of nests that we were locating each year to be able to really address and start looking at what was going on within this system. And just because I wanted to get into some other stuff, I wanted to go over the results really quick. And basically, we didn't actually see that this grazing regime that was developed with the Sagegrass Initiative actually did anything for these species. They didn't respond positive, they didn't respond negative. They were just like, yeah, whatever. I have grass or I have shrubs. I'm gonna do okay, I'm gonna nest. So it didn't seem that these efforts with these grazing regimes that were being proposed by this conservation organization it wasn't bad, but it wasn't doing anything highly beneficial for the species. And that may be, we feel, because grazing is really complex. And it really took us a lot to get information actually from a lot of landowners. Some landowners would tell us everything we wanted. Some landowners were really reluctant to give us that information for their own reasons. And some landowners like, I don't remember what I did, or this is what I did this pasture. And there was just a lot of like, I think it was May, it may have been June, it could have been July. And I don't remember what I did yesterday. So, those are the kinds of things that did happen. But the reality, it is complex. And one landowner said like, well, here's what I wanted to do, but I didn't get the rain I wanted. So now I'm not going to do that. I'm going to sell more of my cattle. And so it's like they're making decisions in real time on a day-to-day basis based on what's happening with weather, what's happening with the market. And one landowner told me like, cattle prices are up. I'm taking them all to market, which I totally understand because that's their livelihood and they're trying to feed their families. So there's lots of complexity in just gauging that and pulling that all into the study we weren't able to do. But it's something we think is worth looking at. And the reality is too, it's a process of an ecosystem. Before cattle, there were bison, there were probably more prairie dogs. There are lots of other things out there in the landscape grazing. And so understanding this process is just a lot more complex, and we set up a very simple study, we thought. And it may be that with grazing, because of the complexity, 7 years is just really not enough to look at it. I know a lot of my colleagues are like, well, we need more of the grazing history. It's like, well, how are we going to get that? It's information that's hard. And the other thing is we are seeing a lot of these ranches being turned over, which is hard because it's not being turned over to other ranching families. It's being turned over to other folks that are coming in and buying up a lot of these ranches in these environments. So one thing we walked away with is, maybe within our study, we thought the big threat that might be going on with sage grouse and potentially these songbirds was grazing. But, maybe grazing is sustainable both for the ranching community and for the wildlife species out there. It's something that, in conjunction, I have a study on greater sage grouse, which is the bird that just popped up there. And we're seeing similar results with the greater sage grouse. It's like this rest rotational grazing that NRC has proposed and implemented on the ground We're not seeing it being sage-grouse responding in a way that we can see high benefits. It's not saying that there aren't, it's just that we're not currently seeing them within the duration of our study. What we are seeing, things that we can't really manage for, is that there's annual variability being brought about with temperature and precipitation. One year, in fact, the first year of the study, sage grouse didn't look very good because out in Roundup, you really needed a canoe. We had that much rain. The town flooded repeatedly that year. It was real interesting. Technicians were getting trucks stuck nonstop. And then I had a year where I think it was 2005. Birds started nesting in the beginning of April because it was a severe drought that winter. And things just dried up. And by mid-June, the birds, we couldn't tell juveniles from adults. And nobody was nesting anymore by the middle of June. They were done. It was hot, dry. Fires started popping up. So I got out of town because I didn't want to be the reason there was a fire. So you see a lot of variability within our temperature and precip. And, I talked to a few of you beforehand that we were talking about things are really weird this year with our weather. I think the birds, that's what drives what's going on with these birds a little bit more than grazing, is what we found out. So we basically conclude that really, if we want to keep things going for migratory songbirds and sage grouse, it's really just to prevent probably the further loss and fragmentation of the sagebrush steppe. In Montana, I don't think we see things quite as bad. In some of the other parts of sagebrush steppe, we're seeing conifer encroachment. We're also seeing the development of energy, especially in Wyoming. There's a lot of development happening down in the Pinedale area, and maybe, trying to help with those efforts and maybe some form of prevention or mitigation, maybe what we need to help sage grouse and migratory songbirds across the range. The one thing that we did find out is we have this different suite of species here where we have a grassland obligate, the thick-billed curlew, and then we have the sagebrush obligate, the brewer sparrow. We probably really need to keep some kind of grazing heterogeneity in the landscape to help fulfill the needs of what those species need vegetation-wise. So not making it homogeneous, let's not do the same kind of grazing everywhere, but let's shake it up and do different things across the landscape. So far, it's maybe continue to do what it seems maybe we have been doing at some level. So that wraps that up. And I just wanted to talk about some more targeted work that we're doing. And this is really different kind of work. It's based in Missoula, and it happens to be on probably we'll see a bunch of robins and western tanagers that I have here. And this work has kind of been part of some of the bird efforts I see at the national level with the Audubon societies. We even see it a little bit with the migratory bird groups with Fish and Wildlife Service. And then it has to deal with this issue of domestic cats and their impact on wildlife. And we're focusing in Missoula as an aspect of a collaboration I have with my colleague with the Boone and Crockett Club, Josh Millspaugh, who actually Holly Holmes is working with Josh. And he had a PhD student who's been working at urban ecology and how wildlife are responding to these urban areas, set out a bunch of trail cams around Missoula, and lo and behold, how many cats we saw within those cameras. It was really shocking. And we would see things like this where you'd see cats hanging out with deer. We don't get a lot of birds in these cameras, but we would get cats hanging out with deer. You'd have cats swatting deer. You have cats chasing squirrels. And the more we've been digging into what's happening in Missoula, I would say we're a little shocked how many cat colonies, we call them, are out there in the landscape. We've been seeing lots of work being done in eastern US around the Washington, D.C. area. In Washington, D.C., I know some of you have been there, it's very different than Missoula. We got different wildlife species around Missoula. It's just a very different urban environment. And so we're starting to look at what's happening, what's going on, what's similar, what's different. We're going to be working purely on the ecology. Okay, is this better? Yeah. Sorry about that. I'm not used to a microphone, so I'm trying. So we're just trying to understand the ecology. We're recognizing there's a huge social aspect. I had a cat for a long time during my PhD. I think that's what got me through my PhD was my cat. It's purely indoor. So we recognize there's also a social connotation here that we're not doing that. We're just providing the ecology background. This work is going to get started here in a couple of weeks with an undergraduate student that Josh and I have getting some work. And we're going around knocking on doors, asking to do point counts and asking to set up trail cameras so we can see, are there cats? Are there deer? Are there squirrels? On the Missoula campus, we have bears all the time. So we'll get an interesting thing on what's happening with our wildlife population and then gauge it to where are more cats versus non-cats using an area. Can you hear me better now? Yeah, thank you for letting me know that. And then we'll see what we can do once we understand the ecology there. So it'll be an interesting study that we're just getting going here in a couple months. Some other work that we're just getting started, and I've been trying to get to the study area, and the snow just keeps falling, making things a little bit more difficult, goes back on grassland birds. And here we have the thick-billed longspur along with the chestnut-colored longspur. Both of these species are, if you look at the state of birds address, these species are really in high decline. And so there's lots of conservation efforts happening, trying to gauge on what's going on, why are these populations declining, and how can we maybe help mitigate some of those declines. We're going to focus out in the Judith Gap area. There's been lots of work on these two species up around the Glasgow area, but we're going to focus in Judith Gap, and a lot of that this is work pulled from the Northern Great Plains joint venture. And what it has is a couple counties here around, this is Judith Gap. If any of you are familiar with this area, this is the Big Snowy Mountains. You come off the Big Snowies and it's just this beautiful grassland. Then it's followed by some sagebrush steppe. But what I have here in red, it's highlighted the presence based on eBird and breeding bird survey data of these species in this area. And it's kind of a hotspot. And we have no idea why. Like, why are these birds here? What's going on? It's a very different environment than up in the Glasgow, Haber, Highline, we call it area. And we're trying to figure out, the birds are there, we see them, they're always reported, and just try to get a better gauge on, are they coming there? How are they doing? Are they successfully breeding and putting off young? And the one thing, it's beautiful, somewhat at a level of native habitat. But we see, and I don't see this in many areas of Montana. There's a few areas I know in South Dakota and North Dakota, and I was hoping Dan Casey would be here because I think he's seen it in some of his work he's done. But we call this improved pasture over here. And it's native, that's not plowed, so completely tilled or disturbed. Instead, landowners go in and they interseed it with annuals, being like alfalfa, or some kind of grain to help increase livestock production. And it's out there pretty prolific in that environment. And we're trying to figure out, like, is this good or bad for the birds? And so we're going to answer those questions of, like, how are the birds responding to this? And then think about, once we know that answer, then we can move forward with some kind of conservation efforts, mainly being led by the Northern Great Plains joint venture and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's probably going to be a very local scale work. Our conclusions are management things that we do, but it may play into a few other areas. This isn't widespread, but it's really interesting. I thought this was CRP when I went out there. And then I talked to the local biologists and they're like, it's improved pasture. And some of the concern is that we might start seeing this more, because then a landowner needs less land to grow the same number of cows or to put that weight on his cattle. And so that's what's like, let's understand first what's going on and then see if we need to make any kind of incentivized program before we start to see some really bad responses. So we're trying to get out to Judith Gap. It keeps snowing. I'm hoping it stopped because we got snowed out there for a while, and when it snows too much, it's really hard to go talk to landowners because you can't drive down county roads because they're all snow packed and drifted. You just couldn't get there. So we're hoping to get this project off the ground here shortly. In a couple of years, I can come back and tell you what we found. So some neat work. So now I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about more broad scale stuff that we're doing. So not just in Montana, not in just a little town in Montana, but it's really work that I've been doing and involved with that covers all across the Western US. It's work that my collaborator here, Patrick Donnelly, some of you may have heard of. He's a spatial ecologist with the Intermountain West Joint Venture. And this joint venture is based in Missoula, so it's nice. Our offices are only 5 blocks from each other. And I've been working with Patrick actually ever since I started here at UM. So we've going on about a 10-year anniversary here, or 12-year anniversary, and working together, and we still like each other. So it's pretty cool. And a lot of stuff that we do has to do with seasonal hydrology or water. And it's coming back to the issue of water in the West and our demand on water, and how are our wildlife populations going to respond to our demands as we're decreasing that availability of water. A lot of our work deals with water birds, shorebirds, waterfowl, just any species that use water out here in the Western US. And a lot of it's been done with wintering areas. We also incorporate migration, and we have been doing some also breeding work lately. And we have been doing this on various species. One of those is the white-faced ibis, a beautiful bird. I hope many of you have been able to see it. We've also done some work on sandhill cranes, and our crane work has been really neat, where you have sandhill cranes. They mainly winter down in the Rio Grande Valley down in New Mexico, and they go there in the winter, and what they do is just do this big, huge funneling up to their breeding grounds, and they are out clear to Broadus, Montana, out to eastern Washington. We'll find breeding areas. We put transmitters on the birds, and we've watched them as they've moved up to the breeding grounds and down to the wintering grounds, and have been able to make recommendations on what areas are most important for sandhill cranes. But what I want to talk to you about, I'm going to focus is on some white-faced ibis work that we've been doing. And this work has been some fun work that we've done. And we just started this off as an initial project going, we really know where white-faced ibis are, but they're kind of been an understudied bird. They're beautiful. We see lots of them. We have really cool eBird reports about them. We see them on breeding bird survey counts. A lot of our federal refuges count white-faced ibis all the time. So was an existing proliferate of data that we were able to tap into. We actually didn't go out our initial study that I'm going to talk about, collect any data, because it was all there. Nobody had just really compiled it all together and looked at it. So it was really fun. The other thing about ibis is they're really dependent on wetlands. And in the Western United States, we know that wetlands are disproportionately have a high value compared to their footprint. Basically meaning high value that everything needs water. We need water, bugs need water, birds need water, mammals need water. It's an essential part of our existence, is we need that water. Disproportionate, because less than 4% in the land mass in the Western US is wetland. And this doesn't count lakes or rivers. These are wetland habitats that dry up, refill, a typical wetland habitat. So it's not a lot, but a lot of species need wetlands. In fact, it's estimated that about 80% of the threatened and endangered bird species at some point during their annual life cycle use a wetland. A lot of that's during migration, but they definitely use these wetland habitats. And we all know that wetlands are really important. They're used for water purification. I did my PhD down in Florida, where those wetlands really cleared out the mercury levels and high mercury, but really were used to help purify the water. They're used for flood control, erosion prevention, And they also have a value to us in some kind of recreational activities, also beyond helping us with our water supply. But we know here in the West, they are under threat. We know there's been a lot of changes in our land uses. We know we have contamination and pollution issues, and those are rising. We also see increased water demands for us. And we also know that climate change is probably causing these wetlands to maybe dry up a little more, once in a while get more flooded. Just depends on what kind of extreme event we're seeing within our climate patterns. And a lot of the work that this work isn't, we know there's a lot of individual wetlands out there, and there's a lot of really good conservation happening at an individual wetland level. And so what I have here is just kind of the Western US in the lighter brownie color. I don't know if that's what the color it looks like to me, is just an illustration. Let's say those are dry. And then more the orangey colors, those are flooded. And we tend to see this in the West where we'll have some dry, we'll have some wet. And we see this nice periodicity happening within our wetland system. And this is really nice for birds that are wetland dependent because they have that ability to move around. As a wetland dries out, they can go find another one. And so we see this kind of system. But we wanted to take more of a network approach because we know these wetlands at some point are related. And water flows in a certain way. So one wetland fills up, may actually feed into another wetland area. And so it's a whole system that's happening and not just like individual wetlands out there in the environment. And by doing this, we're able to manage and look at these wetlands across a broader scale to reduce these things. Like if a drought event does happen, how are the birds responding? Are they just shifting? Or are we actually seeing a population response and seeing fewer ibis out there in the landscape? And so we wanted to take a much broader approach than looking at individual wetlands. We do see patterns, and we have seen patterns over time. We see some areas like here in the Northwest, we might see a big drought event happening, and we're hearing more about these things. So you might have droughts here, but then you might have some flooded areas across the landscape. And that's kind of those questions we wanted to ask. Or you might see some other things happening here in terms of droughts. The whole idea is we wanted to look at what are our wetlands doing, and is that corresponding to what we feel our white-faced ibis populations are doing also. We know ibis are across the West. They are, again, just pretty dependent on these wetland systems. And they also breed throughout our Western US, and they're nomadic. So they move all across our West in a bunch of different patterns. We haven't done a lot of banding or radio telemetry on them to know, do they go back? Do they not? How much do they move within a regional area? And that's work we're actually going to be starting here shortly. White-faced ibis also use a diversity of wetlands for different things. So, which is kind of nice because our wetlands are not all the same. We categorize them as something like semi-permanent, seasonal, or temporary. And temporary might be like it's only wet. You only see surface water for a couple months out of the year. Some years you don't see it at all. Our seasonal, they might be wet. Usually you see surface water during the wet season, whatever that might be. And you also see semi-permanent, which they might be wet for a little bit longer period of time, and it just shrinks and expands depending on the hydrology of that system. So, and they need these for different things. It might be foraging, it might be nesting, but throughout their life cycle, they use these different type of wetlands over that time period. So we asked this question is, how is ibis breeding habitat changing over time the last 30 years? So a lot of this work goes back not only looking at the bird data, but also goes back and looks at the landscape. And we're actually able to do that in today's world through what we call remote sensing. All those satellites that get put up in the atmosphere that are collecting data, where once in a while you might see you in front of your house on a Google. It also is collecting data that helps us look at how are our landscapes changing over time. How big are how fast are cities growing? For us, it's looking at how much are these wetlands shrinking and growing. And some of this information is given to us on a 10-day basis. So every 10 days, we can look at these different wetland characteristics. How are these changes reflected across these different wetland types, being that semi-permanent, the seasonal? And what factors are driving wetland trends over the last 30 years, being if they're increasing in that surface water or if they're decreasing in surface water. So we went out and we got all that great data that's already out there, I already mentioned, like through eBird, through BBS, from refuge biologists. And we identified all the ibis breeding colonies that we knew that were out there. And these dots over here, these little blue greeny dots, those are just the locations of those breeding colonies. And we got information, some general information, like, did we see lots of birds? Did we see a few birds? What years were those colonies active? What years were they not? Because the birds do come and go from year to year. And if it's dry, they might not be there. When it comes wet, we were looking at how long does it take before they come back. And that ends up being about 100, I think it's 157 different breeding colonies we had 30 years of data on, which was really cool to have that much data without collecting it ourselves. We just did a lot of phone calling and downloaded a lot off eBird. We also then define these wetlands and a lot of different characteristics of these wetlands, including like what ecoregion they were in, being like, were they in the Great Plains? Were they in the Great Basin? Were they more of a southwest wetland? Because there's different drivers, being like snowpack drives some of the wetlands that are more up in our northern area. Rainfall probably drives more of our wetland surface water in the southern area. We looked at if they were private or public. We looked at then that seasonal, the temporary, and the semi-permanent wetland types. And we just looked at whatever we could find about these different wetland characteristics that were available to us. And then again, I'll just say that due to just this cool tech with the satellites that are out there, we're able to go and look at those wetland changes over the last 30 years. And then we just broke them up into about 16 periods to do some of the analysis that we did. This work was actually done by a master's student that graduated a year ago and is now continuing to work with me, continuing some of this work a little bit. And then we also are like, you know, we know birds might not just respond to the wetlands, but we also know wetlands are related to what's happening there with our climate. So we also looked at things like temperature, evapotranspiration, how much of that water's being evaporated off due to the sun, and a bunch of other climate variables. And here's just the results. What I have on the map are the different breeding colonies are color coded if we saw they were significantly decreasing over 30 years, are in red. If we saw decreases, but not overly extreme, where you're just like, oh no, we got to do something about them, are in yellow. And then if they were stable, are increasing in blue. Kind of trendy you see there.
Negative.
There's not a lot of blue ones, are there? No, we see a lot more red. We see a lot of red, a little bit of yellow, and even less blue ones. And so of these 157 breeding colony sites, over 60% of them, we are seeing declines in surface water and also use of white-faced ibis. And of those, this region, we call it the Great Basin region, is the one that was probably the one we're most concerned about. And that's because of it had the most breeding colonies of all the other ecoregions. This is where if you're an ibis, you're probably going to hang out or you're going to see them. But 57 of the 87 total breeding colonies had reduced surface water within them. And then we see that similar correspondence with decreases in that surface water within the white-faced ibis. So this is where we have provided information to lots of managers, like this is the area that we're seeing might be of really concern, and we might want to think about what we're doing with our wetlands and our water within this area. This here on the bottom is just a graph showing our years of that we had wetland data for, being from 1988 up to 2020. And I just want to show, this is on this axis is that surface water. And you do see that it has its ups and downs. So you might have a low year with the drought. Then you have a bunch of water coming in. Maybe it's a big rain event like what's happening in California right now. And then you see it dry back out. But overall, when you look over these 30 years, that surface water is decreasing by about 29%. And so we know that this is happening, that we have these ups and downs as these events are happening, but we wanted to look at those long-term trends. We definitely are concerned because we're definitely starting to see some surface water happening or decreasing. So we saw what we call interannual variability, those ups and downs. We're starting to see more widespread drying, which for the ibis, we're starting to see they're probably using less optimal habitats. And that may relate then to more of a population response, or maybe their suboptimal habitats are making them end up not being successful as breeding individuals. It could be that maybe their migration patterns change. There's lots of things that may be happening or how ibis may be responding to these more suboptimal habitats. We're also seeing what we call phenological mismatch. And this means that it may be that time of year, this really occurs in that late season. Ibis are coming back or starting to migrate somewhere, but then they're not finding anywhere to go. And it's because that maybe we have pulled water off of a wetland. Maybe we are not refilling a reservoir. Maybe we're pulling more off for agriculture. Of all the land uses out there, agriculture is probably the number one that's decreasing the surface water out there. So the birds are trying to do their thing, but they're not matching up with what's going on with our wetland systems because we've been manipulating those wetland systems out there. So we're moving on with this ibis work because now we have lots more questions. We're seeing this, wetlands are declining. We don't know what ibis necessarily are going to do, but we know that there's probably going to have an impact to ibis. And I mentioned Patrick here. Patrick has a master's and he's actually using this work to move on and get a PhD, while also being a Fish and Wildlife Service employee at the same time. So right now he's 2 40-hour-a-week jobs, which hope he makes it through because I don't know if I can do that. But we're going to start looking at migration networks and really understand how are ibis moving around in our landscapes. We're also going to look at agricultural dependency. In the fall, we see these birds a lot on flooded ag fields, especially in some of those areas, and we want to see what's going on. And then we're also want to look at these wetlands in terms of climate and land use resilience, being how much can we help these wetlands? How much will they survive and keep functioning as regular systems? And to start all this off, took some time because we've been spending about 2 to 3 years trying to figure out how do you put one of these transmitters on white-faced ibis. And I don't know if you can see that, but here's this little transmitter. And we figured out how to put them on. They're solar power operated. And then we're at the whim of the sun to power them. And we were having issues where they would get them on, but then the power would die. And we played with this for a couple years, and we think we finally have it figured out. And we've been working with some transmitter tech companies to really help us make it going. And we've been successful because we were starting to get data. And these transmitters actually transmit the signals up to satellite. Once we put them on the birds, I call it butt biology. You put the transmitter on the bird and you send in your computer and somebody sends you all that locational information. Just kind of nice. The only time you're really scaring the bird is when you put the transmitter on them, but you're not pestering them every day to figure that out. So we're starting to get some more information about how they're migrating across this Western landscape, which is really cool. We've had some data and that right now those transmitters are confirming all these locations that we've had from data before. So again, you need a speaker, Patrick or I will come back in a couple years and help you guys and tell you more about ibis because you have a lot of them around this landscape up here. Really cool birds. We're hoping now that we figured out how to put them on, we're doing a fundraising effort to go buy some more transmitters, so we can get more birds out there and figure out what's going on across all the West. So we're not trying to put transmitters on just here in Montana. We are putting transmitters on birds we catch in California, New Mexico, and lots of different areas. And so I'm going to make this quick. The other thing we do is we play a lot what I call embracing emerging technologies. And for me, these are tools. As a wildlife biologist and avian ecologist, I have a toolbox. And I have things that I want to just keep putting all these different things in my toolbox to help me answer questions about what's going on with bird populations. And the tools are growing exponentially out there. There's lots of cool things we can do to help complement a lot of the things that we have been doing. And that's a lot of the work that I do. And a lot of this work, I work with undergrads to help me solve and help figure out some of this stuff. And any of you who may have looked at some of the work I do, I like to play with numbers. I'm a geek. I am a stats geek. And so I like to play with numbers and figure out like, okay, how we went and we counted birds. Did we get 70% of them? Did we catch 100 of them? For some species, this is really critical, especially those that are in decline and are small numbers, like being able to really accurately assess them. And so we do a lot with trying to figure out analytical methods and combining analytical or different kinds of monitoring data sets. And one of the things that I'm really excited about actually goes back to the work on sagebrush steppe songbirds, is where a PhD student I have takes data that we all as avian ecologists have collected in terms to estimate nesting success or to know what's going on with nests. And she's developed a statistical, lots of equations and Greek symbols, models where that data can be used to not only understand nesting success, but tell us how many nests are in a given area that we sample. So it's some really good things because in avian ecologists, we usually can estimate the nesting rate or how successful nests are. But to get at that nesting density, it's really hard and time consuming and ends up being really expensive. And so these are just some of the kinds of fun things or little emerging techniques that we have been playing with at the Avian Science Center. We also do things just on testing what we call closure. And closure is basically birds aren't moving in and out of an environment that we're sampling. And we assume that happens during the breeding season, but what really is happening is birds are still moving, and it's more that they're moving out of our sampling area. We all know birds might nest somewhere, but they go forage. I know a lot of the species I work on, they can go forage 5 miles away from their nests. And I don't sample an area that big. I just sample small little areas. So we're looking at ways that once we know if the birds aren't moving much, then we know kind of what kind of analytical methods to use. And I'm going to skip the next one. We're also doing this interesting thing with what we call immersion learning. Have any of you guys heard about immersion learning? No, it's an interesting, these are things that I was hoping I would retire before I'd have to learn anything about, but I can't retire yet. And I heard about them years ago, and I'm like, I just got to embrace them and use these. And so it's these environments that we develop. It might be those VR things you put on and you play games, but you can actually make a virtual birding world. And I don't know about you guys, but I put those things on and I don't like them, but there are ways that we can help learn, engage what's going on in our environments. And we're to the point where we actually can make very natural lurking landscapes from a computer. And with doing so, I can pop birds in and out of these natural landscapes and really know how many birds are out there versus us going out there and counting them ourselves. And then it helps us get at things like how many do we misidentify? How many do we double count when we're going out and doing a BBS survey? And so they're little tools that we've been playing with, and I've been working with a lot of colleagues at the University of Miami, that's where I got my PhD, excuse me, University of Montana, in the media arts, who are developing these kinds of like 3D and multi-dimensional worlds that I probably shouldn't have put this slide up because I barely understand what they're doing, but I know it's kind of going to be beneficial for the work that I do. We also do a lot of things where we just look how we sample birds. This last one where we've been trying to understand the diets of a lot of raptors. And we collect remains, and we have volunteers, undergraduate students come and tell us what species they think it is. And then we've been able to do molecular genetics to also like, okay, how do these two methods complement each other? So being able to start deciphering what's out there and being able to complement both efforts has been a really cool work. And actually that's the student that's presenting at our local Audubon Society as I speak. We're also, another thing that I was hoping I didn't have to deal with was AI, or artificial intelligence. And this is a tool, again, that we're exploring. We've been using these for years with sound with birds, and they're called acoustic recorders. We use those when a bird vocalizes. We go back and there's an algorithm used based on machine learning that tells us what species they are. We also see this kind of technology, and how many of you have used the app Merlin? A few of you. So you take that picture of the bird and then it tells you what it is. And AI is what's helping its training, its learning. As more and more people put pictures in of these birds, they are using that to tell you what it is. And we've been working just on developing some of this AI, and AI is a complex. There's machine learning within AI, there's deep learning within AI. There's going to be another subfield within AI probably before I retire. But we're using that both as auditory and visual to help complement each other. And a lot of this work deals with the fact not our birds call. We also are like, during migration, a lot of birds don't vocalize. And we have a lot of areas that we just can't get to on a regular basis due to that they're pretty remote locations that we might be able to set out some systems to get the information we need. I know Holly was here and we've talked about how do you know anything about harlequin ducks given these pretty scary streams you have to go to on a regular basis. So we're starting to explore like how useful is this as a tool to put in our toolbox, or how much does it really help us or not? And so we're just trying to gauge more of like, how good is a tool? Is it a hammer that doesn't have a handle and we need a new one? Or what is this information that's coming at us? So that's kind of what I mean by emerging technologies. The other thing we do is we spend a lot of disseminating our findings. My students now, they develop apps that we give to managers that they can play with things. This is our white-faced ibis app. So they can go in and be like, so if we see drought in this area, how are our white-faced ibis responding? So it's just something more that we're putting that conservation delivery in the hands of managers who are making decisions on the ground. We also do things where we're putting out coffee table books to talk more about birds. And this is just to help educate people more about the work that's going on and birds and how birds are responding to what's happening within our environments. The other thing I've been mainly involved with is as an educator, besides the college students interested in wildlife biology, I really want to focus on just educating the general public. And I've been collaborating with what's called the Big Sky Aphasia program. And these are individuals with communication disorders due to strokes. So they're individuals that have strokes who can't communicate. Their processes in their brain are there, they just aren't able to vocalize. And we've been using birds as a form of educational material to help them work on their communication skills. That's what my colleague is interested in, is helping them communicate. And for me, I'm interested in just helping them understand birds more. I get questions about, well, why do robins sing so early in the morning and wake me up? So it's been really fun just to get back with the general public and helping them understand bird and bird ecology more. We also are working with a child psychologist, also at the University of Montana, in a living lab, we call it. And this is also based on immersion learning. this really isn't, but it does work more on children and thinking about birds and bird songs as a language and helping kids learn languages and using bird song as another form of language. And for them, they're looking at how do children develop. And the work that I'm interested in is getting young kids really interested in birds and getting more enticed about wildlife in general. And when I talk about we at the Avian Science Center, this is my current group. It's a great group. We have a lot of fun. They keep me on my toes and I keep them on their toes, especially those students trying to finish. And so it's a big group of us that have been doing a lot of work, and these are just the current. And I think I have over 15 former students and staff that were here with the Avian Science Center at one point in time. So with that, I apologize if I've gone too long. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. So thank you for your time and the invite to come up here.
Anybody have any questions? Yeah, I do. Interesting that you have a metal market there, because that's what my question is about. I'm wondering if you have any interest in citizen scientists, I'm gonna say, and replicating these studies on a small scale like
So I was asked if I'm interested in citizen science replicating any of these studies. And, you know, we do a lot of work with citizen science. And we're always more than happy. We always talk, we always work with them. Citizen science have brought so much data to the scientific world. I mean, it's amazing how much we can benefit them. And so, yes, we do. More than happy to talk with you more about that. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? I may have put everybody to sleep. Yeah.
We had a couple of lectures here talking about water restoration and redoing streams back the way they were. One of the things that's consistent in that is the birds all come back. But nobody's ever doing any studies that this is what was there before we did it. And it just seems to me, I know you're more interested in the sagebrush than the first stuff, but all of this stuff that's happening around these restored streams, we were at a project that's down in Ennis, and a massive project. Nobody was looking at the birds, although at the very end, it went like from 6 birds to 67 birds species. But there have been no studies done to confirm.
Yeah, so the question was, we see lots of water restoration activities, but we don't ever see the bird component added onto it. And I would agree. I know the people you're talking about. They've took a class that Patrick and I did, and I do ask a lot of times. There's a lot of bird work to do. And I've been fortunate since I've been here and moved here to the state of Montana. I haven't had to go look for a lot of my own funding. People have come to me. And I think it's just a little bit about educating and being like, well, this is great that you're seeing this kind of water restoration. It'd be also nice to see like what other species are using it, what's coming back, how quickly are they coming back? Especially when it's water. I mean, water, I was in Colorado, there were wars about water. And water rights are huge. I don't understand laws or policy about them, but in Colorado, I know it was really bad. And I think we're going to continue to see some of these water issues. And we have lots of cool restoration activities going on, but it's usually the stream and the plants. And I think we do see people in the restoration discipline that's their focus, and we haven't seen the bird component being added on to it. And I know I talked to colleagues about it, and I'm hoping we can get there. I think there's just so much to do. I would love to be involved with those studies. I mean, I've done a lot of eastern, more arid system work, but I've also done a lot of water work that I think it's really important. Even in these arid systems, the birds need water. We all need water and it needs to happen and I hope it does. I don't know why it's not, but I hope it does. And I think having conversations will help. Other questions? Thank you so much, guys, for your time. And again, I hope to come up here again, or I'm more than happy to help you guys find speakers. It's a great group and I always have fun coming and talking to these kinds of groups. So thank you.